Thank you, Steve. Jason, your example of the cool recent research.
Okay, so let me start by telling you one of the projects we're doing, and it's going to start out possibly a little bit scary, but then I'll tie it back to privacy. And so the project that we're looking at is how do we understand people's behaviors in the real world at very large scales. And the way we're doing this is by collecting lots of location data from hundreds and eventually want to get to thousands of people. So that's sort of the scary part. And you might be wondering, well, what is this useful for? So this would be useful for things like understanding traffic management. This might be useful for things like understanding how public resources like buses and parks are used. It could also be useful for doing estimations of people's health or happiness as well, too. Okay, so these are sort of examples of why we think this would be useful. And this could be a huge data source for sociologists, social psychologists, and so on. But you're obviously seeing the large potential privacy issues if we're collecting lots of data from lots of people. But what's also interesting, too, is that looking at this location data, we found that there's sort of a wisdom of crowds in trying to understand when people are likely to want to share their location data and when they're not. And so we can actually try to estimate based on the numbers of unique people that are at a location whether it's likely to be a safe place to share the location or not. So for example, Carnegie Mellon is a place where lots of people are. So sort of the information that an attacker might gain from knowing you're here is actually not that much. So people we've seen empirically are far more likely to share it. Whereas at your house or my house, this is a very strong signal. This is a place where only a very few people are. And so it turns out that people are less likely to want to share this. And so this actually is something we're looking at in the longer term. How do we understand sort of this location privacy? And are there more wisdom of crowds approaches to try to help people manage these policies? Because I think that these location services, many of you are probably already using them. If you're using an iPhone or Android, you're already using these if you don't realize you are. And these kinds of problems are going to grow in the future. So this is an area for opportunity as well as a great potential problem area as well.
Thank you, Jason. Last but not least, Norman.
I don't know if I'm going to try the microphone. Let's see how that goes. So one of the areas where privacy has really seen an interesting number of challenges over the past few years is obviously the mobile and social networking space. And so at the Mobile Commerce Lab here, we've been trying to essentially study a number of issues associated with what we're seeing today in this space. Some people have questioned the extent to which privacy still matters. Some people have argued that the fact that we're getting close to 600 million users on Facebook means that by and large no one cares anymore about privacy. So we've tried to see to what extent that was true or not. And we've got some very cool results, in fact, in this space. We focused in particular on location sharing, which is about these scenarios where people say, well, under some conditions, perhaps I'm willing to share my location with different people. And what's very interesting in that space is to see how much privacy actually matters, not just in a very casual manner, but also in terms of adoption of applications. So when you look at Facebook, you're tempted to say, well, clearly they're not doing everything right in terms of privacy, and that's obviously an understatement. So maybe it doesn't matter. When you look at location sharing, the situation there is actually much, much clearer. So one of the studies that we conducted has involved looking at what it takes to really capture people's privacy preferences in these kinds of scenarios, seeing how rich and complex these preferences are, and using those results to actually explain why many of the location sharing applications that were launched over the past few years have by and large failed. So what am I talking about? Well, applications that you've probably heard of, like Google Latitude, for instance. I'm sure you remember a few years ago there was a lot of hype around Google Latitude. Applications like Loot and others. And so what our results show is that these applications by and large have failed to gain traction because the privacy settings they were exposing to users were just too limited. Essentially they amounted to whitelists where you could pick some friends and say, those people can see my location pretty much at any time, unless you're willing to toggle your settings, which very few people are willing to do. And so when you do that, as it turns out, there's only a very small number of people you're willing to share location with all the time. In fact, I've interacted with Google a number of times on this, and they mentioned to me at some point that there is this concept of power user. And I said, oh, what do you mean by power user? And they said, well, these are users with 5 or more friends. And I said, that's very interesting, because on Facebook, I don't think that that's what they would call power users. On Facebook, you need to at least have a few hundred users with a power user. And that essentially indicates how much deeper you need to go when it comes to capturing people's privacy preferences if you want them to do sharing with a larger number of people. What do I mean? Well, in essence, think about very typical preferences that people have, like, I'm willing to share my location with my colleagues, but only on weekdays, 9 to 5, and only when I'm on company premises, or only when I'm at Carnegie Mellon. Well, those kinds of preferences, which are very typical, are not preferences that you can capture with all the location sharing applications that have been launched. There's one exception, or two exceptions, Foursquare and Goala. So essentially, these sites have essentially sidestepped those issues by saying, we're going to let people check in. So have users explicitly state that at this proper point in time, they're willing to share. You can do that, but that only captures a very narrow set of scenarios. Essentially, you're at a bar, you're willing to let your friends know that you're there, and that's pretty much it. If I want to coordinate with my wife, let her know, for instance, that I've picked up my daughters at school in time and those kinds of scenarios, if you want to support that, you're going to need much, much richer privacy preferences. And what's very interesting is that our research, and this is where I'm going to stop, shows that ultimately privacy and adoption and success from a business perspective are actually not incompatible. In effect, if you want to have adoption, you will need in many of these more advanced scenarios to come up with more sophisticated ways of capturing people's privacy preferences. If you don't, well, essentially, you will follow the route that Latitude, Google Latitude, and Looped, and others have followed, and you will probably not be successful. So that's a very interesting result. How you do that is probably something that I'll reserve for my answer to the next question.
Thank you, Norman. And in fact, you're not off the hook yet, because I would like to follow up with the next question and start from you. I wanted to do something different, as I mentioned. Every researchers talk about other people's research. Never happens at conferences. So here, I would like each of you to pick, ideally, someone who is not in this room, or at least not in this panel, to make it a little less self-serving. If you cannot find an example, it's okay, collaborators in this panel. But examples of research, ideally different from yours, coming from CMU, which has impacted your work or you found interesting or significant. So I'll start with you, Nova.
Okay. Well, so in fact, I'd like to choose you as my example. And I guess you're not exactly on the panel. And so what I'd like to start by saying is that privacy is a very complex domain. Sometimes we get the perception, reading the headlines, that it's all going to be solved in Washington, D.C. If only, this legislation could be passed. And, today it might be do not track, tomorrow it might be something else. Nothing could be more naive than that. I mean, policy certainly has a role to play in this space, but in fact, when we're looking at privacy, we're looking at essentially the convergence of a number of very complex sets of issues. And in my view, there's no way we can really make genuine progress in this area unless we take a very multidisciplinary perspective. And so in that regard, I found, as I've done research in my area, that I needed, in fact, the expertise of a number of other colleagues, and we're fortunate enough to have a number of very good people here at Carnegie Mellon. I'd like to take your research in particular as essentially opening an entire new direction as far as my work has been concerned. So a lot of things that we've been doing, to sort of follow up on my earlier question, has been looking at how do we enable people, how do we empower them to specify privacy preferences they feel comfortable with. Very challenging from a usability standpoint. But in fact, when I look at your research and I look at all the results that you've essentially come up with over the years, it tells me that even if I'm successful at doing what I've been doing over the past few years, that's not sufficient. Because in fact, as you've shown in your research, there are a number of very complex cognitive biases that will ultimately mean that even if someone does something that he or she feels comfortable with today, he might still regret it tomorrow. Because we're tempted to essentially discount various kinds of long-term effects, and there are lots of other cognitive biases that we're still very interested in learning more about. And unless you take those biases into account, in fact, it's going to be very difficult for us to really gain traction. And so that's essentially the example I wanted to take.
Well, thank you, Norman. I'll make sure we keep a sandwich. We save a sandwich for you at the end of the. Thank you. I'll give you more time next time. By the way, let me remind everybody here that we do want your questions as well. So once again, a remind for everybody, you can get pieces of paper from Sandy up there, and maybe also Jackie, she's still around on the right. Just raise your hand, and everything will happen from there. Jason, your pick.
Okay, so Norman actually took my answer of Alessandro as well, too. But there is a specific paper that I really like, and it's been making me think a lot more about how we conduct our studies. And so this is work that was done with Leslie John and George Lowenstein. And the basic study was to have a survey to understand sort of deviant behavior. So have you smoked marijuana before? Have you ever cheated in a relationship? And so on. And so what was interesting was the three conditions that were used. The first one was a standard long-form Carnegie Mellon privacy policy. And so this would be the one where it says your information will only be used for these purposes, blah, blah, blah. The second condition was a short form of the privacy policy. And the third form, which was the most interesting one, was a really ugly website with bad graphics and looked like one of those teen magazine questionnaires. And you can imagine what the results were. People got very different results, or gave very different results on sort of the teen magazine questionnaire. Right? But why is that? I mean, after you have all this information about privacy, how we're going to manage it, why did people give much more deviant behavior results on that questionnaire? And so, part of it might be that there's the priming issues, but this actually makes me wonder about sort of a potential larger issue in privacy that we haven't really addressed yet. I've been half-jokingly calling these things privacy placebos, which are things that make people feel better about their privacy, but in practice don't really do anything for us. They don't really do jack. And so, I would even say privacy policies in general are this. No one really reads this. All the data will say, okay, people will say, yeah, I've read them before, but if you look at the server logs, no one really reads those. And we've seen that in some of our own studies too. What's the feature you like the best in so-and-so software? I really liked having the privacy logs there that show when my location information was shared. And then we looked at the data. No one actually ever looked at it. And I think that there's other kinds of things along these kinds of privacy placebos too. I think the interesting issue is, can we use these for good, or remember, you can only use your powers for good. But I'm sure that there's a lot of people who would use these for bad as well too. And so I think this could be a really big area for research in trying to understand how do we sort of perceive these privacy issues and how to sort of shape people's perceptions as well.
Which is very interesting, and also, so to make it not only CMU, this brings up also a new stream of research called visceral notices from researchers at Stanford about how you can try to build privacy information which acts at the visceral level. It really impacts you, not just intellectually because you read it, but it can affect somehow you deeply and you may react to that. A similar related stream of studies, maybe Laurie maybe later will mention something along those lines, or Norman as well, is the idea of privacy nudges, how you can use the understanding of cognitive biases, twist them around so that you can anticipate those biases or even exploit them to help people make better privacy or security decisions. Steve.